Members, it's time to resume. And we go into the third part, Mr. Lam. Before we do so, some members are not yet back.
我哋停一停啲其他政府嘅同事翻嚟。我唔緊要啊，局長 OK 嘅，係咪？
All right, it's okay if the secretary is here. We'll take this opportunity to take a longer break. Take the time. Take your time. No hurry.
我要處同
All right, the fire services and also the director of buildings have left. Albert, before we go into the third part, can you provide the papers or documents sought for part 2 as soon as possible? So hopefully no further follow-up is needed. Part 3, please, Mr. Lam. Thank you. Part 3. Follow-up actions on public rental housing's water sampling tests for lead. This is going to be the theme of this morning's hearing. May I seek some basic information from Mr. Stanley Ying, Director of Housing? First, do you regard this as a matter with grave public interest involved? Do you agree? Mr. Ying? I do. Director. An interdepartmental group was set up, chaired by you, by the administration, and follow up on this matter. Do you agree that the working group has important tasks to carry out? I do agree. Given that this working group is in the public interest and is also important, how come for the first 7 meetings there were no records at all? Director, can you please explain to us the reason why? Yes. The incident started in late June and early July last year, and things evolved very quickly. And it's explained by the administration and the HA. The nature and response of the matter were unprecedented. So, at the very first, we had no idea of setting up an interdepartmental working group. Subsequently, in order to systematically review the water quality of PRH developments, we decided that interdepartmental efforts were required. So such a working group was set up. For the first 7 meetings, well, within 20 days, we had that 7 meetings. And after each meeting, we called press conferences to announce the data or statistics to the public. And it was not until the 8th meeting that I came to realize that we were discussing substantive issues and there should be records to let people know what were considered in our meetings. So for the first 7 meetings, we focused on what had to be done at first. So for water sampling tests, I had no knowledge, and HD staff had never done that before. When taking samples, now most of the samples were taken by colleagues. When they were taken to laboratory, we found out that very strict scientific requirements were needed. So there were major, a handful of cases where further discussion was needed, and we then decided that records were needed. That was already at the 8th meeting. I agree with Audit's criticism. We should have had minutes of meeting right from the beginning. Mr. Lam, I'm not satisfied. So you don't accept his explanation. Doesn't matter. Because we haven't come to a decision. All right, point taken, Chairman. Paragraph 3.8. of the report says that other than the director from housing, there was representatives from HD, the WSD, Water Laboratory, and Department of Health. So starting from the first meeting, there were government representatives attending this interdepartmental meeting. Perhaps, Mr. Lam, you can ask for a submission of emails and documents from the department. I was going to ask that. Well, you should ask for what documents would be made available to us. Please do it step by step. Yes, I was going to that later. Mr. Ying. Yes, the 4 departments were present at the first meeting. The rank and names of officers attending. Do you have that? I have to check. Let me explain to you the actual situation. Colleagues from the HD, well, I was always present. But other colleagues from my department, it all depended on what issues we were discussing. For instance, water sampling tests from one estate was present. No, I'm asking for the first question, the names and respective ranks of the officials present. Yes, for some senior officials, I'm sure they were present. But take the WSD as example, they had their supporting staff. We had some information. Please allow me to check. The 1 or 2 main officers from the departments for the first meeting. Director of Water Supplies, were you present at the first meeting? I wasn't. So, whom from the department? As far as I know, please identify yourself. I am a chief chemist from the WSD. As far as I know, our chief chemist or his representative should be present. That means Mr. Kwok, you were present, not me. Mr. Chen, who's now retired, my predecessor. So there was only one representative from the WSD, Mr. Lam. Please address your questions to me. And you have used the microphone next to you. All right, take your time. We have time. Apart from the chief chemists, there should be a deputy director or assistant director present. I have to check whether it was an officer at the deputy director or assistant director rank. So for the officials present here, they were not present at the first meeting? For the first meeting, I believe none of us, because we talked about July last year on the 20th. Mr. Lam, tell us when was the first meeting. Do you have information on that? If not, you ask it from then. The first meeting was the 20th of July 2015. The meeting was chaired by Mr. Stanley Ying, Director of Housing. Yes. Director, may I ask you whether there was discussion on whether minutes should be maintained for that meeting? Not in my memory. Frankly, when we first talked about minutes were at the 8th meeting when I said that minutes should be done. And for the first 7 meetings, nobody had thought of that. Mr. Lam, except by Mr. Ying, he agreed that this matter involves great public interest, and it was a very important meeting of the government. As a senior AO, with decades of training within the government, how come for such an important meeting discussing an issue of such of public interest, how come he had not thought of keeping minutes for the first 7 meetings, and he only thought of it at the 8th meeting? Director, I agree. Looking back, with hindsight, we should have kept minutes for the first 7 meetings. I accept Mr. Lam's view that for such an important meeting, there should have been meetings kept. But at first, things were done very rapidly, and it was also learning curve when it comes to what was discussed in the first 7 meetings. There were coordination among departments on an operational level. If excessive lead was found for a particular PRH estate, then water would have to be supplied by on the streets, and then we have to put pamphlets into mailboxes of tenants, and our colleagues have to cooperate with the WSD in gaining access to take water samples. And when one affected estate was announced, on the same evening we would arrange to go and explain to the affected estate together with a few government departments. These were operational matters. And when the samplings were there, most of us didn't have much to say because experts would tell us about the findings and figures. And then some raised some queries, and then we decided that minutes should be kept. Mr. Lam, exactly when the director said that a lot of operational details were involved and a few government departments were involved, and many departments did not send the most senior ranking officers to attend these meetings. So these officers had to report to the head of departments what was discussed. If there were no minutes, did you expect representatives to use their memory to decide what was discussed in the first meeting and follow-up action? So for the first 7 meetings, did you rely on the memory of officials present instead of keeping minutes? This is unimaginable. This is baffling given that this is such an important meeting discussing matters of great public interest. How come there were no minutes? Mr. Ying, at the first meeting, how many representatives from the HD there were? I can't recall now, but there should be quite numerous. That's exactly that. They or he cannot recollect who were present and what was discussed. I don't believe he could remember the details. There were colleagues present. It was as simple as a direction, an order by the director for someone to take minutes. Usually for important meetings at such a senior level, there would be people to make records or to keep minutes unless there was an express direction not to do so. Director, perhaps our experience differs. My experience is not every meeting will have minutes. What about important meetings? Well, regarding the analysis made by Mr. Lam, we have different reasons for keeping minutes. One would be to ensure that everyone knows what was discussed and for follow-up action. And another purpose is for successors or people to rely on in the future. But we cannot rely on the minutes to be available before we take action, because for minutes to be meaningful, we have to have a draft and for everyone's agreement before it is adopted. But for things with where immediate action is required, I will not wait until the minutes are out. For instance, after some discussion, it was decided what the Department of Health, what the HD should do respectively. We will not wait until minutes were available. We had a lot of communication and liaison by email and on telephone to ensure that our efforts were consistent. So minutes prepared then were not for action, but for record purpose. I think that the sophistry on the part of the director, he said that if minutes had to to be available before action would be taken, then that would delay progress. But that is not the meaning of minutes. Minutes is for future reference. This incident is a important issue with great public interest involved. So for the first 7 meetings, you had no minutes. It's ridiculous and not convincing. Mr. Lee, the Deputy Director, said that even for TMS, you would record attempts made and when nobody was home to answer your calls. So how come for such an important meeting you didn't have minutes for the first 7 meetings? You said that things were urgent. Even so, you should find somebody to do the minutes. It's not that everyone in your HD were dispatched to take water samples. So it's unacceptable that you did not keep minutes for that. Secretary. Of course, the director told us what was the actual situation like. But Mr. Lam, you said that there were no records for what was discussed. This is not true, because different departments would report to the heads of department and would tell them in the meeting chaired by Mr. Ying what were follow-up actions by our department. So such records were present, were there, scattered in emails of different departments. But for formal meeting minutes, there were none. Of course, this is not desirable, as said by Mr. Ying. Otherwise, it would not have been the decision made at the 8th meeting to keep minutes. But usually, for minutes, you need the approval of all present. But back then, we were in a state of war, and things were in a rush. And looking back, yes, we could keep minutes for those meetings. The secretary said that things were very urgent and they were already very hectic. I disagree, because there is bound to be someone in the department who can do the minutes. Para 3.1. There were 7 meetings held between the 20th of July and the 15th of August. There were no minutes, and therefore there was no records on what decisions were made. We're not asking about the source data of water samples. In his opening remarks, the director said that records of source data were there. Of course, you shouldn't have destroyed them. What we want is what was discussed and how come such decisions were made. But such information is not available. As said by the secretary or director, different departments will have their relevant information for reporting and follow-up purpose. The simple question is, how come the HD has not done one? To be agreed to by all departments. All right, the Department of Health, the WSD, the Government Laboratory, and also the HD. I want all relevant emails, documents, notes for files, minutes or reports, whatnot. I don't know how you call them. I'm afraid that you might be resorting sophistry to mislead us. Now, Mr. Lam, you ask for records, but you have expanded that to all relevant meeting documents from the 1st to the 7th meetings. You want all these documents because it's not just their own department involved. I think you ask for such documents. That is better than government minute. Usually, they might only be ready a few months afterwards because they need the agreement of all departments concerned. So you're not just asking for meeting records, but for all documents prior to these meetings as well. Director, can that be provided? Or all departments, can you provide us with such information? Yes, we'll go and check.
I had given some introduction at the beginning. whatever information you're interested, you can request that. It's not a matter of interest. We want to discover the truth. This involves a major issue of public interest, as explained by Mr. Lam. It affects a lot of households, their health. So we're looking at it from a governance perspective. If there's a problem with governance, it has profound consequences. Chairman, if the government cannot provide the relevant information, it would lead to further questions on the public as to whether the government is trying to cover some facts. One area of interest is, how does the government conduct water sampling? Our Democratic Party member, Ms. Helena Wong, has referred to EU standards where they take the first drawn sample, and the government has objected to that approach. So have you discussed that? We are requesting all the information they have on hand and then follow up on the water sampling. Okay, my last question. In paragraph 3.18, regarding water sampling in the TPS units, we see that the audit requested the HD to make requirements with the OCs on whether they had carried out water sampling tests for lead in their estates, and if so, the results of the test. The Audit Commission feels that the Housing Department is the owner of some units that have not been sold. They have the responsibility of ensuring that the water is not contaminated by lead. You need to ensure health. So, Audit Commission have already voiced their opinion whether they can ask the OCs to take water samples, but the HD reiterated that the decision to conduct water sampling tests in TPS estates rested with the OCs concerned. As I said just now, it seems that the TPS tenants who haven't purchased the units, they are like second-rate PRH tenants. They are not involved in water sampling. They are not involved in maintenance. They don't have the mobile booths. The Audit Commission has already voiced that request, and Mr. Ying, well, describing TPS tenants as second rate is not accurate. When the Housing Authority, many years ago, when they implemented the TPS scheme, there were 39 estates designated as TPS estates, and the tenants could purchase the unit they lived in. So put simply, at the time, the HAA policy was that the 39 estates were to be privatized. So, in line with private property arrangements, they have their OCs, and the Housing Authority would be a major property owner, and they would be present in the OC. But daily management, including dealings with the tenants, there was a separate arrangement. There are two arrangements. In other estates, the HA system was not implemented in TPS. Well, whether it is advantageous or not, it would depend on your perspective. There are some restrictions in PRH estates and maybe less restrictions. So you cannot say it's second rate. Well, let's put it this way. You are the major property owner of the estates, and just now we heard you are very responsible towards tenants regarding maintenance, and in water sampling, you have a separate handling of tenants regarding TPS estates, and you have a different arrangement with the OCs. So we want to highlight the relationship between the tenant and the owner, but you cannot shirk your responsibility. I haven't completed my explanation. I just gave you the forward. Now, on water sampling, we did not inspect each unit. We inspected the water supply, including the privatized units. They are the owners. They are not HA tenants. Some are tenants. So even under HA tenants, we looked at the whole building. We looked at the water supply. We looked at the situation of the different water supply systems. So our positioning throughout the incident, for all privatized units, including HOS, it would be decided by the OCs. So in the 39 TPS estates, we know that 32 estates they had conducted their own water sampling, and for the remaining 7, 2 estate OCs had discussions whether they would conduct water sampling, and ultimately they decided not to have water sampling. So I'm talking about the TPS 39 estates established 10 odd years ago. All these were completed before 2005, and we know that before 2005, the estates built by HA, they were mechanically joined rather than soldered. And through our checking, I discovered that prior to 2005, there were no solder material that contained lead, so there was a very low risk. Yes, we now understand more after your explanation. So perhaps you could provide information to help us explore this topic. Well, the Secretary's explanation is not reasonable. Of course, non-TPS estates, you can inspect the whole building systematically, but for TPS estates, you can still help the tenants take water samples. Now, if there was a problem, you could notify the OC. You can tell them that there was a problem. There was no change in the indoor plumbing. There must be a problem with the water supply. The thing is, the issue is you didn't undertake that exercise. Now let's take a look at paragraph 3.13D. Regarding table 6, sample 4, the HAHD, they could not provide any email, and according to Water Supplies Department recollection, I find this situation very ridiculous. Such an important discovery, and there's no record. You have to recall on staff memory for removing these factors. Is that really accountable to the Hong Kong public? Have you protected their health? Director Ying? Well, let me provide more accurate information. In the 7 meetings, we decided to for certain reasons, we decided to remove 5 samples that had excessive lead. They were items 3, 4, 5, 6. As I said in the beginning, there was no meeting, but we do have some raw data, raw information, and that can explain why 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. And we do have a summary here, and we agree that the sample 4, we cannot find the water service WSD raw data, and we can't find the relevant email. That's not ideal. So in the 7 meetings, there were 5 samples that were removed, and we do have raw information on sample 4, but there was no written documentation why it was removed. That's a fact. I'll have other colleagues follow up. Paul Jie. Paragraph 3.9. And let me quote. It says that for the purpose of determining whether follow-up actions were required on the water sampling test of a PRH development, the government had adopted an action level that as long as there was a sample exceeding WHO provisional guideline value of 10 microgram per liter for lead, the entire PRH development would be classified as an affected estate, regardless of the number of blocks. See, so I'd like to clarify this strict decision. When was it decided, and which government department, which grade of official made this decision? I'll defer to Ms. Lam. Ms. Lam is, well, according to our understanding, last year at the beginning of the excessive lead and water incident, the Chief Secretary had convened an interdepartmental meeting. At the time, we discussed how to assess water samples and when should we determine the estate had excessive lead. At the time, in the midst of discussion, we had discussed this arrangement. Well, let me add a little bit regarding lead in water. When would action be required? The government has always been using 10 micrograms because the WHO has such a figure. The other question was about Ming Chung Estate. We had to declare it had excessive lead. So on 20th of July, you have a record. I mentioned that in our interdepartmental meetings, we don't have a minutes of meeting, but in Ming Chung Estate, we had a decision. And after the interdepartmental meeting in the press conference, we had disclosed that. Paul? Based on the 2 officials' response, I'd like to clarify. Wing Chung Estate, you said that on 20th of July there was a decision, but I want to ask a general question. This strict standard, at the beginning of July, there was an interdepartmental meeting chaired by the Chief Secretary, and did you agree on that 10 microgram standard? The meeting chaired by CS, I was a standing member in Kaiching Estate when excessive lead was discovered. The government had to deal with it on a crisis basis. So when lead was involved and when a building was affected, our decision at the time, first we had to use the WHO 10 microgram standard, and second, how many samples were needed. So if we had 1 sample with excessive lead, we would rather err on the side of caution. So you want to confirm? Mr. Paultier said is accurate. Thank you. So based on that important decision, and is it fair to say that 1 water sample consequences could be profound because the whole estate would have to take further tests, and you need further action. Well, Chairman, an estate might have 2 or more buildings. The sampling was systematic. So in an estate, they have different blocks, and if we found lead, they would be affected. And then we had water mains, we had a separate water supply, bottled water, and so on and so on. Yes. There was a public outcry and crisis management, and you had to apply a strict standard where even one building, one water sample had excessive lead, that you would have to take on the measures mentioned. So if there was an error in one sample, it would have profound consequences. It would affect your work. Would it be fair to say that? Well, it was a decision at the highest level at that point in time. Well, with hindsight, you might come up with different interpretations. Was it too strict? Would other countries handle it differently? We also have heard from the international consultants convened by the WSD, but at the time, the public they were very worried and concerned, and there were people who conducted testing privately. Well, so given this background, how you select samples, how you take samples, how you remove samples, and how you determine and confirm whether an estate is affected, and for each estate how you conduct them, crisis management, all these decisions are interconnected. Is that correct? Yes, there is an impact. Of course, at the highest level of government, where the interdepartmental convened by the CS, we had the requirement. You need to take water samples, and we would adopt the WHO standard. And if we had one sample, how we would handle it. So, how did the specifics were handled by the staff of the professional departments. Well, if you don't mind, let's turn to paragraph 3.10. It refers to 29 meetings. There were 4 stages from 20th of July to 18th of November. There were 29 interdepartmental meetings, and from 12th of August to 18th of November, there were some review meetings. And the third phase, on 25th of August, there was a consolidating and recording. And in the fourth phase, 30th of September to 18th of November, there were a separate 8 meetings. I think these were follow-up meetings. So, I don't think there would be any disagreement to that classification. Yes. So based on our discussion just now, if we were to say that in the 4 phases of meetings, the critical phase would be the first, from 20th of July to 7th of August, would it be fair to say that? Well, it depends how you compare these phases. In the first phase, we spent more effort on coordination on technical coordination. In the subsequent meetings, there was less talk about that. On water sampling, let me add, in the interdepartmental meetings, some items were not discussed by us. For example, the Hong Kong government had its own methodology, and when the water samples would be taken, was it static samples and sampling methods? The AWSD, when they take samples, they have a methodology, and
now for the 7 meetings, there are 5 samples that were disregarded for some reason. So the importance of the meetings lies with the 5 samples. I can't say which part of the meeting would be more critical, Mr. Chair. That's fair enough. If there is something wrong with a sample, and if it is disregarded inappropriately without any justification, then it can make a world of difference. Because if you're merely saying it without executing what you say, then it's no good. Director? If you refer to Table 6 for the 5 samples that were discarded, I can go into great detail. Do you need to have further details? No. I think we can see this from the document. To be fair, if I may refer you to 3.11, Table 5, in Note 1, the 7 meetings didn't carry any minutes, but for the all 49 samples, they were taken between the 14th of July 2015 and 7th of August 2015, and these 49 samples were included in the reporting process. So you're not merely relying on the minutes of the 7 meetings to confirm the details. In fact, you do have email exchanges between departments. Director? Yes, I do have a similar analysis. By way of information, in Table 5 and Note 1, when we read the Director of Audit's draft, all the figures were accurate. But if you want to focus on the 7 meetings and what were discussed, I think we can have further breakdowns there. Table 5 on the right-hand column. 49 non-compliant samples were discussed. In fact, we discussed 37, because for 12 before the interdepartmental meetings, the BD and HD WSD did take action, and it was there were 5 that were discarded by the interdepartmental meeting. For Shui Chun O Estate, those who were concerned would get to hear that quite a lot, because the Director of Water Services would did explain why this regional sample was discarded. Paul, 3.13D, Table 6 and Number 4, there was no justification for discarding that. You relied very much on the memory of the Water Supplies Department. Now, we mentioned the communication between departments. Did we have anything in writing in this regard? Sample 4, the Director of Audit asked the question, and we handed over all the raw data as detailed in 3.13b. Now, for sample 4, the raw data lies with HD and the WSD. When the sample was taken, we looked at the environment and all the situation, and the samples were taken by the professional samplers. And if the samples presented the problems, then the data would lie with the WSD, but we couldn't find the data. If we had, we would have given it to the Director of Audit. Paul? Time is almost up. I'd like to say that there are meetings that didn't have any minutes, and there were problems with some of the samples. The number may not be large, but based on what we said, one non-compliant sample would lead to the sampling of the entire block. Do you think that there was any human error in this regard? Director? Table 6, let me say a little bit more here. For 1, 2, 3, and 4, for the reasons cited, we discarded the samples, but that didn't make any difference to the situation. And we have covered all these estates. Second May, Hong Kong 2, we wouldn't have done this differently. Regional estate, as I said, the Director of Water Supplies did explain this. Number 6, Yiming Estate. For some reason, we didn't accept the sample. All the rest of them were okay. That was the meeting was held on 20th of July. We also discussed the Yanming Estate, and there was one sample that was in exceedance, and we considered that estate as an affected estate. There were a whole host of reasons which we explained to the Director of Audit. We didn't want to say that the samples were not in exceedance of the limit. Secretary, Mr. J made good observation. Kai Ching Estate, when the problems were first identified, we took this as a very high risk. We rather erred on the side of caution. We didn't deliberately say that there were no problems when problems were picked up. Of course, there was this concern raised by Mr. J. Of course, we have to work on the basis of scientific judgment. We don't really want to cause any unnecessary alarm, but we took this as a worst-case scenario. Yes, for the first sampling, we did mention something like this. We're going to include these observations in our report, and these observations have highlighted all these actual problems. Anything else? No? Mr. Stephen Ho, and then Mr. Xiu and Ms. Tanya Chen. Thank you, Chairman. I go along with the two previous speakers. In the previous part, it was the TMS, and there was a kind of recurrent work, and we have to achieve a value for money. Now, this part is about something, some kind of emergency, and we have to ascertain whether the government has done it right. There are inadequacies in the whole saga. I think that this is a good example to illustrate the government's crisis handling ability, and this is leaving a lot to be desired. As Mr. Ying said, you had all these meetings. It wasn't until the 8th meeting that you decided to have the minutes, and maybe you were not capable enough to cope with the situation. I think you ought to review the situation. Now let me turn back to the minutes. For the 7 meetings, how did you actually communicate between departments? What sort of documents did you require them to bring along to the meetings? For emergencies like this, the initial period would be important because that would make a difference to people's perception. Now, it was only the 8th meeting that you had the minutes, And I mean the minutes for the initial meetings would be terribly important. I think you might wish to dig up the email exchanges for the 7 meetings, assemble them, collate them, and present them to us for our information. Now for the 7th or 8th meeting, when you decided to have the formal minutes, you have not any intention to complete the minutes for the previous 7 meetings. Now this is an issue that remains unresolved. So in the days to come, let's hope the things will be okay. I hope that there will be resources devoted to training for senior officials. Second, TPS, tenant purchase scheme. The government is the owner. In some states, there may be 60–70% of the units that have been sold, but in fact, the government is the main owner, who took the decision not to conduct water sampling for the TPS. Now you go into the flat and examine the taps and tell the tenants whether there are any problems. Now, did you discuss with the OC of the TPS about the findings of your water sampling? I suggested the TPS should also have the units tested. Otherwise, the OC would be held responsible. Secretary, as chairman of the Housing Authority, I dealt with the issue really consciously. For PRH or for TPS, the units were built by the Housing Authority, but by the time they became TPS units, then their status would be totally different from the PRH units. That's a matter of principle. It was my decision to do so or not to do so. Secretary, we appreciate what you said, but this is a unique situation. This was picked up by Mr. Ho and Mr. Lam. Can you tell us more about your relationship with the OCs? They are your tenants. You do have the duty of care to safeguard their health. I understand the policy that you mentioned, but you do have the duty of care there to the tenants. You talked about the policy. We appreciate that, but that's gone beyond the policy, the duty of care. For the 39 TPS estates, 32 of them have conducted water sampling. The OC and the TPS units didn't leave the problem unattended. They understand what the housing department did. We told the community that we're facing this risk. We're urging the private estates to get on with the water sampling as well. So there was no question of us ignoring the risks of the residents. Mr. Ho, if the government said that sampling was also taken from these units, what is the figure? What is the statistic? And how did the government communicate with the OCs of the TPS? It's no good just to write to them about this. Or can you give us a paper or some more information and statistics? Secretary? Yes, we can have a look at the details and supplement the information. Secretary, for these TPS, do you have or do you undertake any maintenance for them? And if you do, then why you can carry out a maintenance for the TPS residents, but not so much the water sampling. Did you have any maintenance for TPS, Secretary? The two areas are different, Director. Now for the in-flat maintenance, we do carry out the maintenance for the PRH tenants. Now for the outer wall, the external wall maintenance, no, we won't do this for the TPS. Now the water comes from the same source. If you're not doing this, would you carry out the service for them? Because you do have the undertaking to provide the services. Mr. Ho, Director, as the Secretary said, in the light of our experience in water sampling in PRH units, we do this in a systematic manner. Now the whole system we progress from the mains to the housing units, and this covers the entire estate. If you do this on the basis of individual units, that would not be a systematic way. Let me follow up on this. There are 39 TPS estates. A lot of them have already conducted water sampling. Now the OC has the responsibility, but for the 39 estates, some of them haven't done it. You do have the responsibility. We're dealing with the responsibility. We're not here to challenge your policy. I'm asking you for the 39 TPS estates. There were some that haven't conducted any water sampling. Mr. Lam has made it very clear. If you've done so, then you can tell the OC about it. Mr. Ho, I agree with that, Chairman. I'm not really challenging your policy. If you don't have the majority ownership, now for the 30 units, 30% of the units, did you conduct any water sampling and tell the OCs about it? I said already that you did a bad job in crisis management. Now 3.15, there is an expert that has been hired to look at the sampling protocol. Now, how much did you spend? Or is the expert good enough, the international expert? Now, previously, the government hired some experts that are not really experts, like the crocodile catcher. You spend more than $1 million, but the crocodile wasn't caught. The Marine Department, there was an expert hired, and that wasn't worth any salt. So what about this expert, Secretary? Before I hand you over to the Water Supplies Department, members are very concerned about the TPS. I'd like to make this clear. As Chairman of the Housing Authority, it was the Housing Authority that dealt with the TPS. If you don't have any systematic way, I mean, if you talk about the systematic way of water sampling, then that's the responsibility of the entire block. No, we don't have any dispute over that, but you do have the due process. You have to conduct the sampling. If there are problems, you can tell the OCs about it. But have you done that, or do you don't see the need to do it? We're not challenging the policy and say that this is wrong. We're saying that you do have the responsibility towards the tenants. Mr. Ho, well, this is not part of the routine water sampling. This is an emergency issue, and you are putting yourself into a straitjacket, the policy straitjacket. This is being bureaucratic. People get the impression that these TPS tenants are second-class tenants. I wouldn't go so far as that, Chairman. We have gone this far, and it seems that you haven't really taken care of them. You said that you have the policy to cover the entire estate, but you do have the duty of care, which is different from your policy. Policy is on a more holistic level. We are highlighting this particular issue. I hope that you would consider this so that the TPS residents would not be left behind. All right, shall we complete this?
What about paragraph 3.1.15? Well, the expert mentioned in this paragraph was employed by the Secretary for Development. Can you speak up, please? The international expert was employed following the recommendation by the Committee of Inquiry. So on the 1st of June, the Secretary employed 4 experts from the UK, Australia, and the North America. And there were 2 local experts too, and they are all international. They have international experience. For instance, the expert from the UK, he is an expert responsible for regulating the U.S. supplies authorities, and in Australia, he has done a lot of investigation for WHO. They've been employed by the Secretary, and they have very actively follow up on issues we expect them to study for us. All right, then money involved in employing them. And have you considered whether their scope of experience is relevant to that of Hong Kong? I think in one of the states in the U.S., they had an lead in water incident too. I don't know that you have a mechanism, but I just want the public to know how you selected these experts. For instance, there was an expert on crocodile, and he failed to catch crocodile boy, and instead it was caught by an AFCD staff. Yes, I have to follow up with the Bureau, the Development Bureau, because the experts were employed by them. We have 3 overseas experts and 2 from locally. We cannot just rely on international experts. We need experts who are conversant with local environment. And we have employed a few because someone from Australia or Europe may not have a full grasp of the matter. We've employed local experts because we believe we have employed international experts before we think that they are needed to supplement our local experts, or I will not pursue further. You have distributed over 2,000 water filters as an emergency measure, and many have reflected, yes, filters can be installed free of charge, but it's more than a year. What about the filter costs? Will the administration pay for these costs, or will contractors or households be asked to foot the bill? And do we have to pay for those filters? Mr. Ying, the installation and the replacement of cores or filters are done by contractors. They have used 2 models, and the cores have to be replaced on a regular basis. And we've advised tenants to call a hotline from the contractors to replace the cores. So some have got their cores replaced for 2 times or 3 times already. Yes, contractors can do their bit. And contractors, of course, don't want to be bothered once the filters are installed. You do have a duty to your tenants. after you've asked contractors to install the filters, have you gained access to flats to check what is it like after 1 year? Because you do have a duty of care. Have you exercised your duty of care? I don't think they can complete the replacement of the water supply system within a couple of years. So your question was very pertinent, Chairman. Yes, you don't have to answer us now, but please give us information afterwards. From time to time, we make progress reports to the public. Just last week, we submitted a report to the Housing Authority. It's not that we do not monitor contractors after they have installed the filters, but when, for instance, if replacement of the system is being done in a particular estate, we do maintain liaison with the contractor concerned. Because the contractors are responsible for installing the filters. Who foot the bill is a separate issue, but you do have to ensure that PRH tenants have safe water to use, so it's your duty to follow up afterwards. Mr. Shiu Ka-fai. Thank you. A quick question in the interest of time. Para 3.6 on page 41. Well, you said 91 when 93 samples were affected, samples were spotted. Para 3.6, can you tell us the reasons for that? In short, for a long time we've been telling the public that we've completed sampling of water in PRH, and there were 91 affected samples or non-compliant samples found. The Audit Commission found out that there were 2 samples in the source data, but they were put to a separate, wrong category. They were non-residential premises held by the HA. We said at the press conference that we were directed by the HA to cover all PRH estates ASAP. Residential blocks should take priority because water is for human consumption. And these 2 samples were done later, and they were later in the process. Because after we have covered the residential blocks, we also have to cover welfare premises such as kindergartens and other things. So the statistics were back, but due to miscommunication, the 2 samples were put under a separate category. But they did not affect our follow-up action on the affected estates. Para 3.27. I was told here that the progress works in the common areas of the 11 affected PRH developments ranged from 18.5% to 45.6% as of July 2016. Do you have any concrete timetable for PRH residents as to when works can be completed? It's just last week. At an HA meeting, we made a progress report to members. Now, we're talking about the common areas here. We've explained that we'll work on common areas first. Well, in Kaiching Estate, there are 5,000 units. And therefore, the date of completion will be different. We're working on common areas, and we have also started in-flat works in Outer, Kok Upper, and Lower estates. As regards when we can have all the works completed, we can't say now. Because in common areas, we can work on one single pipe, but for in-flat, we have to go in one by one. It's just like TMS. We will have to coordinate with the tenants. Usually we take 1 day per unit, and also depends on the state of interior decoration. Some of the flats are rather simply decorated, but some not so, and those units we need a longer time. So I cannot give you a completion date, but it's going to take time. Yes, it's hard for you to do it, but you must have a target, say within 3 years, because you have a duty to do it, because there is a health concern. We've been asking you so many questions because you have to be accountable to the tenants' difficulties, and also your need to do it are two separate things. We're not saying that we are not going to do it because it is difficult, but you've asked me whether it will be within 1 or 2 or 3 years. We don't have any basis to pinpoint a particular time. At first, we were eager to give the tenants a safe and convenient water supply, so we use water wagons and tanks and also standpipes, and subsequently we gave them filters as recommended, recognized internationally that it is a useful way to ensure safety. Now within a flat, the pipes are limited in length, but for the common areas it can cover a lot of places. So after we have completed the common parts, I'm sure this will go a long way in improving the water safety of tenants. But we do agree that flats should have their pipes replaced as well. But after we have completed our communication liaison with tenants, we're going to extend the scheme to all estates. Paragraph 3.29, installation of water filters. We're told that 29,000 odd premises are affected, but for about 2,000 flats are not going to install water filters. So it's about 7.4% of the affected premises. Many PRH residents are very anxious about this matter. So I'd like to ask, how come these 7.4% are not willing to be installed with water filters? How come they cannot be contacted? Are these people living there? Secretary, well, we do not just try to contact them once, and there is no calling an end to this exercise. We've been installing water filters last year, and we're saying to tenants, those who haven't got water filters yet, we're willing to install retrospectively for them. But as I said, all households are different. Some have a great concern for lead in water, but for some, they may think that they have their own ways of doing it and they don't need your water filters. For those who have come back overseas, they know what to do. For the first few minutes in the morning, the flush water will be used for doing the laundry and for washing things. Professor Anthony Zhang said that in the initial phase of this incident, everyone were very anxious, and they were very strict with the storage of samples and so forth. Now, I'm from the retail sector, and I've got plumbers who are also my constituents. And they queried whether the administration had to be so strict. Views were not unanimous within my sector. However, I think the government should not be too anxious when there is a major incident. For instance, chicken, we haven't been consuming mainland chicken for more than 20 months, whereas Macau and also mainland are still consuming mainland chickens. Yes, FHD has banned importation of mainland chickens. Now we're spending more than $200 per chicken. And people in Macau are still eating mainland chickens. It's just like the fire involving mini stores. Of course, we're unhappy, and two firemen sacrificed their lives in that fire. If the industry were to follow your direction, I'm afraid the over 200,000 mini stores in Hong Kong had to be demolished. Please return to the subject. Yes, turning back to this lead and water incident. Would there be the opportunity to revise the rules? Some follow WHO guidelines or standards, and some said that the American standards were not too strict. Can we end by 12:45? All right. Yes. Yes. My question is finished. Did you? What questions? What further questions you have? Oh, I'm done already. The secretary said that at the beginning, due to public sentiments, they were very strict with the standards. Now that things have calmed down, would you look at the worldwide standards? When lead was found in water in Kai Ting Estate, well, we followed the WHO standards, which have been used by the water authority all along. It's not that all of a sudden we used that standard. If one sample is found to be non-compliant, then we consider the risk involved and regarded the whole block as being affected. Is this too strict? Looking back, should we review the standard? I think we can review it in the future. And as for the procedures, the international expert panel set up by the Development Bureau is looking at that. Tanya, Chairman. The Secretary told us that there is an high-level meeting led by the CS4A. Since July 2015 to August 2016, we'd like to know the number of meetings. Do you have the dates now? I don't have it at hand, but my colleagues can provide the dates later. And that review panel, under the responsibility of Mr. Ying, can you give us the meeting dates in between July last year and August this year? The interdepartmental meeting, all right, from July to August. Can such be provided later, as well as the documents sought by Mr. Lam? Then I have no further questions to ask. Let's look at the documents first, because those dates are very, very important. There must be an agenda for all meetings. Chairman, yes. Yes, the agenda. And I also like to know there were meetings in August of the steering committee led by the CS4A. Yes, all the way until the committee of inquiry. All right. I'd like to know whether Mr. Ling attended the meeting chaired by the CS4A. I did. A review panel is being led by Mr. Ying. I'd like to know whether he would report to the secretary after each meeting. The two meetings are different in nature. I understand that. Well, the Meeting chaired by CS4A is an overall coordinating meeting in response to the incidents. Sometimes the CS4A would give us guidance and coordination.
That is, the specifics of systematic water sampling and the problems they encounter and how to resolve them. Thank you for the supplemental explanation. So if Mr. Ying had a review regarding the interdepartmental meetings, so would he have to report? That was the day-to-day. If there was nothing particular, he didn't have to report. Well, if he also took part in the high-level meeting, did he participate or did he have to report? In the high-level meeting, it depended on the agenda, discussion items. So different departments and officials would have to report. So if he didn't have to, if there weren't minutes of meetings, then Mr. Ying, how did he base his report, on what material did he base his report to the CS? Well, in the 7 meetings, even though we didn't have minutes of meetings, we can provide the relevant documents, and I would like to reiterate, they were operational meetings. If I recall, there wasn't time for providing an agenda because we knew what we had to do. So, on each occasion, the Water Supplies Department, they would provide an Excel spreadsheet saying what samples and what values they came up with. And if our colleagues thought there wasn't anything of note, they wouldn't discuss that. But if they found certain cases worthy of attention, we'd follow up on that. And usually, subsequently, the next day, we would hold a press conference and we would tell that in Mengchangxun we took so many samples, how many exceeded the levels, and in Soichino it was more noteworthy. There were 9 samples and we had to remove some samples. So it was very operational, and when we have more information, you can find out for yourself. Well, frontline, they need to report, and the high-level decisions need to be executed. And if there's no feedback, then we don't know we know what happened in the frontline. Well, the high-level meeting would make some decisions, and then we would have to coordinate the frontline. For example, in Mingcheng Estate, there was a sample that exceeded the standards, and I did not seek instructions from anybody. The science was there. I would I might have told the secretary, because we would have a press conference, and sometimes even Mr. Paul Chan would have to attend the PCs, and we would say we have samples from certain estates to announce, and so on. So that kind of report was given, but I didn't feel that we needed to seek further instructions from the senior officials regarding certain water samples. I'm saying a lot of samples were removed, and I don't think it was not needed to be reported, and they could just recall and rely on memory. And I would like to ask Mr. Stanley Ying, since when did you have regular meetings? Well, we couldn't set dates at the initial period. It's noted in the document. I just want to confirm the dates, and allow me to check my documents. The chairman also noted in the footnote that there were some changes throughout the incident. It was a learning process for us. We would hold meetings every 2 days, and then Mr. Albert Lam, did you convene those meetings? The interdepartmental, or Mr. Enoch Lam rather. Mr. Stanley Ying had already told us his procedure. Could you respond to Ms. Tanya Chan in your department? How did you report to your officials? Did you do that? Did you conduct that exercise? Well, from the secretary's level, if there were important matters involving affected estates, typically we would notify the secretary when necessary. But just now Mr. Ying stated clearly, these meetings were very frequent, and after convening an interdepartmental meeting, the CS meeting would follow up. Why do we ask is because the housing department, they look at it from the building perspective, but you look at it from the water supply perspective. So you also have to describe your role in the department and your role in the interdepartmental context. So you also need to ask if they have records, and after that, so we can save it to the next round. So after this question, we would like to enter the third part. You are referring to the technical, the interdepartmental technical review. Do you have information? We can liaise with the housing department. We're not asking about HD. I'm asking your department. Is Ms. Tanya Chan referring to footnote 40, note 40? That was the interdepartmental meeting convened by me, and I noted that there was a change in arrangement. There was a technical review arrangement. We had date samples from the government chemists and the WSD. We discovered that some small number of samples, there were some outliers, statistical outliers, and we needed to pay attention. So the technical review had to follow up on that, and such that we could arrive at a decision regarding a certain estate. So I was responsible for that, and we have records. I understand. I wanted to ask, when did you start to have regular meetings? Because in the second phase, you had 2 meetings per week. So in your first regular, when was your first regular meeting? And I need to go back and check. So after we have all the information, we can follow up, and we can conclude this part here, and on the next occasion we can settle on a date. You will need to forward the relevant information. Thank you very much. We'll meet again on Monday at the UGC. Thank you.